Well, thank you, Sheryl, and thank you, Radina. That was a nice job, and I want to try to move and build off that a little bit. And note, I want to switch both between high level and more technical discussion of some important issues and things that are existing as we think about methodology and strategic management research. And it's important to think about how we communicate not only within disciplines, so to those that we want to find as our reviewers, but also how we think about others in the audience. And so if you think about a lot of what Radina talked about, is when you give a job talk, for instance, you're speaking to a much broader audience who often doesn't have the same familiarity with your topic, but also in many cases comes from a very different methodological background. But understand that methodology itself, while we don't always consider it this way, really sets the boundaries for specifying theoretical questions. And it actually plays a larger role in theory development than I think we often give it credit for. And choosing the right methodology is very important, but it also has very drastic consequences. And so what I'm going to talk about today really comes from help from two of my colleagues, Paul Bleasy, who is the current editor at Organizational Research Methods, and one of our PhD students, Johnny DeBruyne. And Paul joined us about 5 or 6 years ago here at the University of South Carolina, coming from the Army, where he had a very long career working on innovations and implementations and interventions for field infantrymen primarily. And Paul has a psychometrics background, and I have an econometrics background. And we started talking very early on and realized we have very different forms of communication. And after about 2 hours of discussing a common problem, we realized that we were talking about the same thing, but had never been able to figure it out. And this all stemmed from an original discussion I had with Rob Ployhart, who's one of our HR scholars and is also a world-class statistician and psychometrician. And when Rob had a paper under review at AMJ, the reviewers constantly asked questions. They were using a random coefficient model, HLM, multi-level model, mixed effect model, whatever you might want to call it. They're all basically the same thing, but the reviewers kept asking for econometric models. And at the time, Rob was really struggling with what the difference was, and we had a hard time communicating just the two of us. And so we've spent a long time trying to figure out, how do we actually talk and when are we talking about the same things? And so to give you some background about why I think it's important to focus on methodology and how we use it to specify our questions, I want to think about what does it mean to really have endogeneity, and how do we think about it differently? So when I say macro, I'm primarily referring to strategy scholars, and micro is a lot of my colleagues on the side that come from an organizational psychology background or an organizational behavior background in many cases. And we have to recognize that our vocabulary and our tools, they often differ very significantly. But an important question is, how can we enhance our ability to communicate across disciplines through analytical specification, but also latch on to different analytical tools that allow us to address different theoretical questions. And we started by actually doing this through this paper that came out last year in the Journal of Management on really how do we deal with different ways of analyzing panel data. When we started writing this idea, we actually had the idea of specifying how do micro and macro scholars deal with endogeneity. And that's the paper that Aaron Hill and colleagues ended up writing. We stopped writing that paper because we couldn't figure out how to write it. And when Aaron published that paper, I was very excited and very impressed because we had no idea how to condense all of that information into a small format. And that's what I would encourage you. I know he's talked about that paper with you all. I would encourage you to really read it because it's a great overview. And we focus much deeper on panel data, where panel data is just data over time with multiple repeated observations for what our micro colleagues would call level 1 entities, a term that we don't use very often, but it's the lowest order level of observation you're going to find in your data. Coincidentally, they don't really use the term panel data. And when we think about this idea of, in this case, panel data, our goal often is just to ensure that we have repeated observations to increase power and to ensure that any effect that we identify that might be of interest theoretically is consistent over time, which is why we often use time fixed effects as well to ensure that the effect is not time bound. And so by increasing power and ensuring that the effect is not contextualized in a certain period in time, we believe that we get greater ability to claim causation and that it allows us to provide a stronger test of a hypothesis. But this methodological choice also has consequences. And I think it's important to understand what those consequences are, but also know how to deal with them. So in our paper that we published, we actually include a larger table, it's much bigger than this, to try to illustrate different terms that we use in strategy research and that micro researchers use that in many ways are often the same. So I know that reviews that look at endogeneity will often state that, there are so many articles that have been published in SMJ, AMJ that use endogeneity, but that word almost never appears in the Journal of Applied Psychology. And it's sort of as if, maybe micro researchers aren't talking about it. But you will find in the micro research corollaries like threats to validity or omitted variable bias or common method bias that get much more at the heart of the endogeneity issue, which I think is what Aaron and his colleagues were talking about when they said be very specific as to what the issue we're talking about is. But they also have terms in micro that we don't use again, like level 1, level 2. But then I think it's really important to note that in random coefficient modeling or multi-level modeling terms, what they refer to as a random effect is often what we call a fixed effect. And what we call a random effect is what they think of as a fixed effect. And 7 years in having this discussion with my colleagues, I still don't always get it. And they don't always get me when we talk about this. And so we have to be very specific about what we mention. But we wanted this table to be really a bridge to try to illustrate how do we form a common language about what we're actually doing. And so I want to illustrate that using some data that Paul and I created. We actually took real data and just sampled out some data. It's 196 firms randomly selected. We created a balanced panel for reasons I'll talk about later, but it's 5 years of observation. So you see the same firm over and over again. And we just wanted to explain ROA, but based on 3 explanatory variables that are used in the literature. There's independence of the board, the average age of the directors on the board, which is just a measure of maybe how much knowledge and experience that they've gained over time. And then the number of women directors on the board, which in this period was starting to grow, but was still very variant across firms. And so if you want to address a model like this, both micro and macro researchers start with a random effects model, although their random effects model is a little bit different. But in the end, if you analyze data with random effects, you allow the effect to vary both within and between firms. We find a positive relationship of the average age of the directors on a board and the number of women directors with firm ROA. The interpretation is designed to be relatively straightforward. Having an older board and having more women on the board leads to better performance. And these variables were lagged, so hopefully we can establish a little bit of causality. But this model has serious problems. And the problem often is that these coefficients actually are polluted with both the within and the between firm variance. And as long as that variance is systematic in nature or unsystematic, it's randomly distributed, it becomes part of the error term. It's not a problem, but to the degree that it can be explained by unobserved firm heterogeneity, most of our models then default to using fixed effects. And so I can do this using XT-reg and Stata, so I can use a GLS specification. And again, I find that directors having an older board on average leads to higher firm performance. But now women directors are no longer significant, which specifies to us that there's a little bit of a difference in the relationship depending on whether or not I use fixed effects. An interesting note, and Paul Bleasy and I disagree on the degree to which this is interesting. If I do this in either mixed effects modeling or using GLS, I get the same exact answer. But I do want to note the most important impact of switching between a random effect and a fixed effect model is that a fixed effect model provides only a within firm estimate. And that is for a given firm, for within firms, ROA now is really higher when the average age of directors is higher. What it does not tell us is that if a board that has directors that are on average 60 years old performs better than a different company's board that has directors that are 56 years old. And that is a very important specification, because when Paul and I differ on this, and this is our mixed effects model, the reason that we differ is Paul is very interested in the micro world at individual differences over time. And our theories often are about differences between firms. And so if you really want to explain differences between firms, once you start using a fixed effects model, we have serious issues because the coefficient cannot interpret this. And one of the, as we looked through the literature and we looked at how people talked about these coefficients, how they use this methodology, we got back to the notion again that methodology sets the boundaries for theoretical specification. But the way that our papers are written becomes theory followed by methods. And authors very rarely select their method and then go back and revisit their theory. And so there's often a great theoretical disconnect between a between-firm theory within a within-firm test. And in this case, actually, it's important to note that, not only do we get the same estimates here, but if we go look at the difference between the within and the between specification, we can run a Houseman test. And the Houseman test is just going to tell us that there are inconsistent coefficients across the models, which really means in our language, so we say that means that there's the presence of unobserved heterogeneity, and therefore we have to control for that. But what our micro colleagues will tell us is it's also indicative of what they refer to as an emergent effect. And that is an effect that differs across levels, whereby the effect at the individual level or the firm level is different from the effect between firms. Unfortunately, the Houseman test does not actually tell us where that is. And if you used a fixed effect specification, we can no longer test between effects relationships. And so I just wanted to illustrate how you can utilize models that have been brought from our colleagues to answer some of these really cool questions. And so you can actually not use a fixed effects model, but recreate fixed effects specifications by including the mean level of your independent variable predictors. And so in this case, you'll see that we've now included 3 different variables. They're the group mean of the variables of interest of the panel as a predictor. And I can use this in either GLS or a mixed effect model. By doing this, you will find that the estimates for board independence, director average age, women directors, those are within firm estimates still. They have not changed. So the coefficients, the standard error, and the p-value are all the same, even though we've used a random effects model. When we incorporate their raw score plus the group mean, what we actually find is that the coefficient for directors average age suggests that the relationship between and within directors is different. And what it really tells us, and this is important for the next slide, is that the between firm effect is 1.33 units less than the within firm effect. All that it's telling us is that the nature of the relationship between the age of directors on a board of directors and the firm's performance is not the same when we consider the within firm effect as it is between firms. A limitation of this model, though, is that it does not tell us whether or not the average age of directors for the firm over time between firms, if that is significantly different from 0. To do that, you have to test a model that was originally proposed in the strategy literature by Cerdo et al. So Cerdo, Withers, and Semedeni in 2017 in their SMJ article on Tale of Two Effects, where they consider, in this case, what is called a demeaned version of the independent variable. They call it their hybrid model, and all that you do is incorporate a difference between the IV's raw score and the group mean. What you get here, though, is a different test, and it actually tests down below whether or not the correlation or the coefficient at the group level, the between firm effect, is different from the individual or within firm effect. And you'll notice if you go back again to the prior slide and take the 1.33 units, if you take 1.12 for the director's coefficient, average age coefficient, subtract the 1.33, you get the coefficient that we find here, but we find no significant effect. What we do find, though, is that the impact of women directors on firm ROA is highly significant. And what this tells us is that within boards, having older directors means better performance, but it does not find that when different boards have different ages of directors. But we find that boards that have more women that serve on them, on average, perform better than firms that have fewer women that serve on them. This answers very, very different theoretical questions, but that does not mean that they are unimportant. And if you test a fixed effects model, you are often, in many cases, I find that papers often are not testing the theory that they truly propose. And so you could argue that we're really interested in both within and between effects, and these models allow you to do it. The last thing that I think is important to think about with these type of models is noting the amount of variation that you're trying to explain. And microscholars use what's called the interclass correlation coefficient, which just estimates the total variance that can be attributed across levels of the model. In our case, the ICC for ROA is about 33.4%. So 33.4% of variance is within or is firm level differences, whereas 66% is found within the firm. It is not uncommon to find ICCs that are in the range of 80 to 90%, which will give very little variance to explain. And so if you're attempting to explain a within firm relationship, but there's no variance to explain, you can find strong effects, but in the end, they might not be as meaningful as we'd like them to be. And running the ICC up front can help us understand whether or not we have emergent effects. And so to really summarize that, why I think it's important is that the ICC often suggests that there's considerable variance to explain, and where it might be. Is it within or between firms or both? The Hausman test specifies the nature of whether or not relationships differ across levels, but it cannot tell us where or how it differs. But if you run these models like the hybrid model, we can actually utilize methodology to test the difference in the nature of the relationships at different levels. And this test is incredibly important to really specify closer to our theory so that we understand what we're testing and make proper implications. Without actually tying back your implications to your choice of methodology, you could end up making policy prescriptions that are not supported by your data. So if you were to go back to the start and take this, if you were to tell boards that they should scrap all of their directors and hire directors who are older because they will then perform better, there may be some evidence that that is true, but it does not mean that they will perform better than their competitor who has an older board, for instance. And so you really want to think through the implications of what you're looking for. And instead, it might just be better for that firm to allow their directors to get older and wiser and grow together as an organization rather than making the wrong implication. So a couple of things I think are really important to think about as you deal with data and understand your methodological choices. One, unbalanced panel data, which are pretty common, may have real problems. The solution most often in the literature for how to deal with unbalanced panel data is to interpolate. So if you have missing data, to try to replicate the variance covariance matrix by replacing data that is missing. This works only if the data is missing at random, but also understand that fixed effects models are underlied by ANOVA estimates, and ANOVA estimates are often unreliable when using unbalanced panel. So the hybrid approach that we talked about probably produces better estimates. It can reproduce the fixed effects estimate exactly, but the random effects component will be slightly different. Also be very careful when you use a fixed effect model that has invariance and predictor variables. I see this a lot with independent variables that have no variance over time for a firm. So if you used a fixed effect and your independent variable might be the existence of a woman CEO. If firms in your panel do not switch back and forth between conditions or treatment effects, there is no variance to be explained, and it will actually artificially limit the amount of variance you explain in the model because there is no observed variance that you're seeing. But we also often use a lot of variables in fixed effects models that, while they're not time invariant, they are not also very time variant. A good example of that is firm size. One of our ICCs we recently ran on firm size was about 0.96, which suggested that there was only about 4% of variance to be explained between firms. And so if you control for that, it's in essence the correlation between a firm fixed effect and the firm size is R equals 0.96, which introduces some multicollinearity to our model that the statistical programs don't always pick up on. So be very careful about the choice of covariates. Choice of covariates is also something that's very strong or very large discussion in the micro literature right now, where they're often reducing the number of covariates they use. And the last thing to think about as you look towards these models is a Hausman test is often given as the omnibus explanation of fixed versus random, but we don't really think about what it means. And the Hausman test uses all coefficients to test for consistency and the trade-off between consistency and efficiency. If you were to go read, though, Cerdo et al.'s paper, they actually have a nice paragraph where they talk specifically about, and they refer back to Shunk's research in 2013 about the Hausman itself being unflexible and its inability to disaggregate where the differences in the relationships lie. And so I'd be careful about, I'd caution in the use of a Hausman test to justify a methodology because it alters our interpretation of what we're trying to accomplish. The last thing that I wanted to share briefly is one other thing that I think that we could do better to actually enhance our research and drawing from some of our counterparts, and that is really considering the value of time. When I gave my job talk here at the University of South Carolina, I presented about 8 years of panel data. And the department chair at the time, when we went to lunch, said to me, I don't understand why strategy scholars utilize data over time without utilizing time as a predictor. It makes no sense. And that's always stuck with me because I didn't have a particularly great answer for that question at the time, because we often see time as something to control for. But in many cases, time has great explanatory power. And there are a number of growth models, some that come from econometrics that have been slightly incorporated, but there are a lot of really good psychrometric growth models that could be incorporated that might have good power as well. And I just wanted to introduce one, and that is to think about time as a continuous predictor. It's a linear variable rather than a fixed effect. If you do this, you cannot have time-based fixed effects, so understand that. You could have time fixed effects if the balance panel has different years in which the participants are included, but that gets very complicated. In this model, though, we have a basic set of controls, and we're trying to see whether or not ROA is increasing in a linear fashion over time. All that we've done is a variable 1 to 5 for each of the years, and we find no relationship. It's not changing, at least in a positive manner. In general, it is positively increasing, but not in a significant way. But I can then actually look at, over the course of the panel, I can interact it with my variables of interest. Here we did it with what's called a cross-level interaction, where we took a level 2 variable, the mean, over the panel window of the director's average age, and we interacted it with time. And it looks like this. We find that over those 5 years, that firms that had lower director's average age over that 5-year window have positively increasing ROA. And those that had older director's average age over that window had a decline in ROA. And all that it allows you to do is test a trend that's happening over time. And you can do this really well if you go back to the discussion of how to incorporate like Bayesian inferences, and you can use Bayes growth models to actually specify trends that are better than linear trends in many cases, and think about how these variables are changing over time in an important manner. If you're interested, Paul Bleasy has a different model that builds off this called the discontinuous growth model that he talks about with Jonas Long. And really, it's an analog to a difference and differences model, but it allows you to look at when everybody in an instance, or there's an exogenous shock that everybody experiences, you can actually parcel out the variance in a DV that's owed to the shock or the timing of the shock. You can look at how much that interrupts or creates a disruption in the firm, and then calculate a growth that comes out of it, a trajectory. And so micro researchers often talk about these slopes as trajectories over time. Are we recovering or are we suffering based on a series of different covariates that you can use to try to explain this? In the end, what I really want to impart is that the gap between scholars really isn't there because we have different methodologies. Our methodologies actually come out to the exact same answer. I can get you this whether or not we use Stata or R. Our paper has code that will do every model using mixed effects modeling and GLS in Stata or R. But our choices are what really is defining us. And we often default to fixed effects models, but if we do so, it creates limitations. And if we instead focus on these ideas of emergent effects, it allows us to explore new theoretical possibilities and test theory in different ways. And a lot of what's happened in like the groups literature or the teams literature at the micro level is looking at these emergent effects and how they create human capital resources, which really kind of bundle up to the upper levels of the organization and give something that often is quite interesting. So hopefully we can better harness the power of our choices to really specify the theoretical test that we're trying to implement. And by thinking more clearly about methodology and allowing methodology to influence theory at the same time that theory influences methodology, I think we can make significant advances going forward. That's all that I have for everybody today. So I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Great. Well, that was a really interesting presentation, DJ. Thanks for there's really a lot of detail in there that I think was really helpful on the methods, as well as kind of speaking to this challenge of speaking across disciplines and even within the same discipline. So I thought that was really nice. Do people have some questions for DJ?
Yeah, I have a question. I have a couple of questions actually.
Great.
Yeah. So I was trying to understand towards the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned something like fixed effects only measures within firm variance and is not particularly suited for between firms. I'm trying to understand why you are thinking that way, because fixed effects, okay, if you use the xtreg function that you mentioned, you have between firm R square, within firm R square, they do provide that. But fixed effects at the end of the day, you can imagine them as dummies, right? You can pull, it's basically you can run an OLS with the firm dummies, right? Then why, I mean, I'm trying to understand why you think that fixed effects are not measuring between firm, like for example, because let's imagine fixed effects as OLS with firm dummies, not as xtreg. Let's forget for some time that it's xtreg.
Sure. And you can use, if you just use reg and just do a factor variable for company ID or whatever it is.
Yes, yes.
And actually, I'm more than happy to send anybody who wants it the code that I use to generate all of the data that I have, and all the code that tests anything that I presented today, that it's all publicly available. So I'm happy to provide it to anybody. And if you use reg versus xtreg with fixed effects,
yeah,
you will get the exact same estimates. It will not change at all.
Exactly.
The difference is that the coefficient itself, so at the point where you enter the dummy variable for each firm,
yeah,
you have explained all between firm variance in that dummy variable. And so it does not test whether or not the relationship is different between the two firms. The coefficient now only can explain the variation that occurs within that firm over time. And so if it's a positive relationship, it merely means on director's average age, it merely means that if in 1 year, and this does not mean that it's increasing. So Paul and I have this discussion for a while. So it could be 1 year, the board is 58 years old on average, and the next year they add a younger director and they move to 56. Performance may get worse because they got younger, but then as they get older again, they add an older director perhaps, performance gets better. It's just telling us within firm, but it will not tell us that the board that has an average age of 60 is better performing than a board that has an average age of 56. You have eliminated that variance entirely in the fixed effect specification.
Yes, but I'm trying to understand why is that a problem? Because I am measuring then it should be better. I'm measuring the same firm as it is increasing the other variable. So I'm measuring the counterfactual is even better, no? I mean, then I'm measuring the same firm in different times as the other variable, as the independent variable is changing. So it's the best counterfactual because two firms might not be the same, but the same firm over time is more similar, right? I mean,
I agree and I disagree with you. And I disagree because some of the most fundamental questions in strategic management research have to do with interfirm differences that enable competition. And so if you want to take like resource-based theory at its heart, it would say that firms that have more valuable resources perform better than firms that have less valuable resources. And a fixed effect specification, you cannot test that question unless you use fix the effects and test the emergent relationship. Now, Paul Bleasy fully agrees with your question because Paul is interested in what happens to people over time and less interested than, what happens from one person to another. If you really have to think about the question that you're trying to ask, and part of the point of the hybrid model is that regardless of which of the two models you use, fixed effects or the hybrid model, the d-mean model, we get the same within firm relationship. And so that coefficient is not going to change, but now we can test something that historically strategy researchers have not tested. And that in and of itself can be interesting. If you take a paper, I know Joanna was here, she had a really good paper in Journal of Management about like CEO greed, CEO wealth, and as CEOs have more wealth and what happens over time, right? And when you use a fixed effect specification in a paper like that, the alternative becomes when CEOs make more money, maybe firm value could go up or down, but that's within a tenure, which is very different from should another company alter how much they're willing to pay a CEO at a given point in time. And so you want to be very careful about how we think about the implications of that and how we treat individuals then based on whether or not the effect is within or between firms.
I understand that, but I'm talking purely from counterfactual's point of view. If I'm following the same firm over time, then isn't that a better count? Like I understand that the presence of one CEO in one firm might not be the same as presence of another CEO in another firm. I mean, of the same CEO in another firm. But if I'm only interested in the effect of CEO's age, is it not better to put the CEO in the same firm and follow how the firm performance of that firm changes with the change in, because everything else is being held constant. No? I mean, from identification perspective, in a sense that when you follow, keep everything else constant and just let the CEO age vary within the same firm. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm.
I think at this point, we're getting into a lot of really interesting detail, but I'm going to suggest we take this offline so that we can start, see if there's some other questions from others who are listening. And also because we have another presentation that I'd like to make sure we have time for. So it's great to see the level of engagement. I think it's really cool, but I'm going to suggest to move it offline at this point. Are there some other questions from anyone else?
Hi, DJ. Thank you for your presentation. I just got a quick question. I'm often wondering the same questions about terminology when it comes to the finance literature, especially when your quantitative data gets really close to finance literature. And so I was just wondering, in your paper, did you look at the finance literature and look at those kind of the verbiage they use and see Any interesting findings? I was just wondering.
No, we didn't do that in large part because we wanted to try to speak to the audiences within the management literature and really try to bring us closer in terms of what are the similarities and differences that we have. That, you know, our big focus was there's more common ground than I think individuals on both sides of the management perspective really know, and we wanted to try to bring those together. Finance is a little bit of its own animal. I think it's much closer to the strategy research, and I think there's a lot that we can benefit from. But I think their terminology actually would mirror our terminology fairly closely, although it has some differences. I will say that the literature we did review was rather lengthy as it was, so I don't want to open up to a new literature. And finances, it's a tough one to read.
Great.
Hi.
Do we have some other questions?
Hi,
Ilaria?
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. Hi, DJ. Thanks so much for your presentation. I was wondering with respect to how to approach, what to include in your main analysis as the primary model versus, what to have in the robustness test, whether you have some suggestions with that respect. Thanks a lot.
Sure, I'm happy to think about that. And Bert might have some suggestions too, as he talks through like how to respond to reviewers in a good way. But I think it's important to tie your primary test as closely as possible to your to your theory of interest. So getting to that is important, and creating parsimony is important. If I remember, Boyd et al. Had a paper in about 2005, though, that also showed in SMJ that having multiple constructs of interest that test the same construct, probably best in an index, is most valuable to us. So I would try to triangulate as much as possible, even if the variables of interest aren't closely related. That's less of a problem in many cases. But the point to me of robustness test, so I try to separate out supplemental analyses from robustness checks. So supplemental analyses are good if you have to avoid the appearance of harking and to provide alternative tests of theory that are natural extensions from your theory. I think supplemental analyses are incredibly important because they can help if you have areas that you believe are natural extensions, that we can alter how we test the data to help further illustrate the theory that you have proposed. I think that they're incredibly valuable. So I think it's important to have supplemental analyses that you believe are consistent with your story also appear not only in the body of the text, but in the paper, not as just a footnote and not as a results are available from the authors upon request. Robustness checks, I think, are important to rule out alternative explanations for your findings. And so I'd be very careful with them and how you explain them, because sometimes you can get into trouble if you don't provide enough detail on them. And it makes it sound as if, you're trying to find ways to slice, it can be very difficult as a reviewer to find main effects that have no relationship and then see supplemental analyses where if we slice the data 5 different ways, we find them in 2 or 3 of the 5 ways. And it's hard to know what to do with that as a reviewer. So I'd be very careful about the way that you utilize robustness checks to attempt to rule out alternative explanations rather than to overcome what you perceive as a weakness if you fail to have what is often what would be termed an insignificant finding.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think that was a great tie-in to what Bert's about to discuss in terms of responding to reviewer comments. Are there any other questions before we move on? I see there's one in the chat from Valerie. Valerie, do you want to share it with us?
Sure. Just a quick question. How do you deal with the fact that most widely used dependent variables in strategy, such as research methods or ROE, tend to follow a fat tail distribution rather than normal?
That's a more difficult question. So there are ways, I mean, you can engage in our base transformations. That can work if we, if we could explore it. One of the advantages of many modern statistical packages, though, is that they can account for that. And you can utilize, your Huber-White standard errors and other tests that can help you overcome the lack of, and especially if you're using any maximum likelihood estimation, they can often overcome that. But transformation is a good way. I would also say that in a fixed effect specification, that the distribution of the dependent variable becomes different when you consider the within variation versus the between variation. And so recognize that like using ROA in a fixed effects model may not be the best approach because ROA is designed to be a scalar. And so it addresses differences in firm size, but in a within firm relationship where there's not a lot of variance in size. And so I'd point you on that regard to look to the paper on ratios. It's the Cerdo, Busenbark, Coleman, Lapine, ORM, divided we fall. I would look at that because there's some strong benefits to potentially not using ratios, especially since we can control, it can overcome some of these problems with distribution and we can control for the scaling variable as well. So that's another way to do it. You'll find that that's becoming more and more common in our literature as well. You could find it in paper I just published in SMJ in January of this year. And it does create its own challenges though, because then you have to control for all of the individual components of every other relationship in the data, and they're all highly correlated. So you have to figure out that, but solving one problem often creates another. So we just deal with those trade-offs as we go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for DJ? Otherwise, I don't see anything in the chat. So then I will, really great presentation and also really helpful discussion. So thank you all. And then finally, Bert will be sharing with us how to deal with and respond to reviewer comments. And I have to say that I think the comments that have come up in this discussion already really speak directly to some of these questions, particularly I think DJ's distinguishing between supplemental analyses and robustness. I think that was a really, really important point.